Hello, my name is Jason. I am 41 years old and I want to share my story with you. It happened 7 years ago when I got married to Mary, my first wife. We were married for 12 years. We had 2 children, George and Laura, and we lived a normal life until one fateful moment. One morning, on my way to work, I was in an accident. A pickup truck drove into the oncoming lane at high speed. The next thing I remember is waking up in the intensive care unit, covered in plaster and bandages. I was very grateful to the doctor for giving me a chance to live, but I had no idea what was ahead of me. After 2 weeks of treatment, the doctor told me that my lower body was not functioning and that I would spend the rest of my life in a wheelchair. These words hit me like a ton of bricks. How could I live like that? How could I provide for my family? How can I be a father to my children if I can't run, play, or even stand? The despair was overwhelming. Mary burst into tears when she heard about it. At first I thought it was out of sympathy, but I soon realized that her tears were for herself. It was hard for her because all the responsibility was on her shoulders. She had to take care of the house, the children, and now her husband, who could not walk. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her that we would get through this together, but deep down I was afraid that she would not stay by my side for long. The hospital became my new home for the next few weeks. Nurses came and went, doctors checked me, and physical therapists tried to help me adapt to my new reality. But the hardest part was the emotional struggle. I was afraid that I would never be able to play soccer with my children or dance with my wife again. The simple joys of life seemed to be stolen from me, and I could not do anything about it. First, Maria visited me. She brought the kids, and when I saw them, I had a reason to keep fighting. George, my 10-year-old son, was trying to be strong for me. Laura, who was only 7 years old, did not understand what was happening. She asked when I would get better. I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth. At first, they visited me 3 times a week, but over time, their visits became less frequent. I asked Maria to come more often, but she always had excuses. The children were at school, she was tired, she had a lot to do. I understood that it was hard for her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was moving away from me. One day she came to me alone. There was no sadness in her eyes, only determination. She put a folder on my lap. The divorce papers. Jason, I can't do this anymore. I didn't sign up for this. I'm still young, and I need a normal life. I need a man who will be there for me. I expected this, but not so soon. Only 2 months after my accident, she was already leaving me. My hands were shaking as I held the papers. I wanted to scream, to beg her to change her mind, to remind her of the vows we had taken. But I knew it was useless. Maria had already made her decision. I didn't sign the papers right away. Instead, I spent the night looking at them, feeling the weight of my broken life. The next day, I learned from a friend that Mary had been seen with another man, an older man, about 50 years old. My blood froze in my veins. Had she already moved on? Was she cheating on me even before the accident? I almost went crazy with rage. But then, something inside me shifted. A new fire broke out inside me. I wasn't going to let this be the end of my story. If Mary thought she could leave me and take everything, she was wrong. I would find a way to fight back. I didn't know how yet, but I swore to myself that I wouldn't go down without a fight. That was the beginning of my journey to revenge. The days after Mary's departure were the darkest of my life. I felt abandoned not only by my wife, but by the world itself. I was trapped with a broken body, unable to support myself, let alone fight for my children. My mother did her best to comfort me, but that was all she could do. I was 34 years old, a grown man, and yet I was completely dependent on a woman who was supposed to be enjoying her retirement. The humiliation burned me from the inside, but so did my determination. For months, I hardly left the house. I spent hours staring out the window, watching life go on without me. My children were out there somewhere, calling another man Dad. The thought was unbearable, but every time I thought about fighting for them, I was reminded of my financial situation. Maria had taken almost everything, leaving me with nothing but my mother's modest house and her pension. Without money, I had no lawyer. Without a lawyer, I had no chance of getting custody. So, I felt powerless. But this feeling could not last forever. One day my mom asked me to help with her small shop. At first I resisted. How can I help someone when I can't even take care of myself? But she insisted. You need something to focus on, Jason. Something to take your mind off the past. I had no choice but to listen. And, surprisingly, she was right. At first, I just sat behind the counter, doing small tasks, counting money, checking inventory, greeting customers. It was a menial job, but it gave me a sense of purpose. And the more time I spent in the store, the more I realized its potential. My mother had run it for decades, never expanding or adapting. But I saw opportunities everywhere. I spent nights reading about business strategies, marketing, and finance. I learned everything I could, determined to turn my mother's small shop into something bigger. The fire inside me was rekindled, and this time it was not only about survival, but also about regaining my strength. One evening, an old friend came to visit me. His name was Mike, and we grew up together. He had heard about my situation and wanted to know how I was holding up. We talked for hours, reminiscing about the past, until he finally asked, Jason, have you thought about fighting back? I hesitated. How? I have nothing. No money, no resources, no way to fight her. Mike smiled. Maybe you don't need money. Maybe you just need a plan. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized he was right. I had spent months feeling powerless, but what if I could make a difference? What if I could outsmart Mary and get back what was rightfully mine? I didn't know exactly how, but one thing was clear. My revenge was just beginning. With a newfound determination, I threw myself into the shop. What had once been my mother's modest business was now my battlefield. I analyzed every aspect, prices, suppliers, customer interaction, and made changes that would maximize profits. I introduced new products, partnered with local businesses, and even developed promotions to attract more customers. The results were immediate. Sales improved, foot traffic increased, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. The success of the store not only improved my financial situation, but also gave me back my self-confidence. My wheelchair was no longer a symbol of defeat. It was just a part of me, not a limitation. Every day I worked harder, despite the fatigue, knowing that every dollar I earned brought me closer to my ultimate goal, to get my children back and take back what Mary had stolen from me. One evening, as I was closing up shop, Mike came back. He came to see me regularly, wanting to know how I was doing. You're doing well, Jason, he said, looking around the busy store. But tell me, have you thought about the next step? I nodded. I need a lawyer. And I need to prove that Mary is unfit to raise my children. Mike smiled. Then let's make it happen. Over the next few weeks, we strategized. Mike had connections, a lawyer friend who was willing to take my case at a reduced rate. I gathered all the evidence I could. I talked to neighbors, former friends, even teachers at my children's school. Slowly, a picture of Maria's new life emerged. Her lover was a wealthy businessman, but he had a bad reputation. Gambling, infidelity, even rumors of fraud. If I could prove that my children were in an unstable environment, I would have a chance. The day I applied for guardianship, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It would not be easy, and I knew that Mary would fight tooth and nail to keep me out of their lives. But I was ready. This time I would not back down. The first battle happened faster than I expected. A few days after filing for custody, I received a court notice. Maria demanded that I be completely deprived of my visitation rights. She claimed that I had been away for too long, that my presence in the children's lives would only cause confusion and emotional distress. It was a blow below the belt, but I could not expect anything else from her. I met with my lawyer, a sharp but fair man named Daniel. He assured me that we had a strong case. Jason, the court can't just take away your father's rights without a good reason. If we can prove that Mary's new environment is not stable, we have a real chance. But we need more than rumors. We need concrete evidence. That meant surveillance. Mike took it a step further by introducing me to a private investigator he knew. His name was Carl, a former police officer with a knack for solving mysteries. Within a week, Carl had gathered incriminating evidence. Mary's lover, Richard, was drowning in debt. His addiction to gambling had already cost him one failed marriage, and there were rumors that he was involved in fraudulent business deals. To make matters worse, Carl obtained a video recording of Richard bringing strangers to his house late at night, some of whom had criminal records. Armed with this information, Daniel prepared our case. The next hearing was to determine whether I could regain partial custody or whether Mary would succeed in cutting me out of my children's lives forever. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. I replayed every moment with George and Laura in my head. How George looked at me, how Laura held my hand when she was scared. I refused to let them forget me. No matter what happened in court, I was ready to fight until my last breath. When I entered the courtroom the next morning, I met Mary's eyes for the first time in months. She looked different, colder, more distant. But I wasn't here to beg her. I was here to win. And I was ready for war. The courtroom fell silent as the judge took his seat. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept a calm expression on my face. Mary's lawyer was the first to speak, portraying me as an absentee father who only showed up to cause discord in the family. They emphasized my disability, implying that I could not provide a stable environment for my children. These words were painful, but I did not let them shake me. Then it was our turn. Daniel presented the evidence we had gathered, Richard's financial problems, his addiction to gambling, and the suspicious people who came to my house late at night. The judge's expression hardened as he reviewed the documents. I could see doubt creeping into his eyes. It was the first small victory of the day. Mary sat still, her confidence beginning to waver. She did not expect me to fight back. But it was only the beginning. I came prepared, and I wasn't going to stop until I got my children back. While the hearing was going on, the judge listened attentively. Daniel called our investigator Carl to the stand. With a firm voice, Carl presented the surveillance footage. The courtroom watched in silence as Richard met with known criminals, gambled for large sums of money, and even had a violent fight with Mary in front of the children. The incriminating evidence painted a clear picture of instability. Mary's lawyer tried to discredit Carl by questioning the legality of his surveillance, but Daniel was ready. He presented official police reports linking Richard to illegal activities, bolstering our arguments. The tension in the room grew. For the first time, Mary's composure cracked. She looked at Richard, her eyes full of fear and frustration. The judge leaned forward, rubbing his temple. "Mrs. Carter, given the evidence presented today, I have serious concerns about the welfare of your children in their current environment. I need time to review this information before making a final decision." For now, that was enough. The fight wasn't over, but I had rocked Mary's world. And I wasn't done yet. Days passed, and the weight of the judge's words weighed on us. Maria was silent. No threats, no counterattacks, just silence. This was more alarming than her usual hostility. It meant that she was either regrouping or losing control of the situation. Either way, I wasn't going to let my guard down. Mike and Daniel kept digging. We needed more leverage, something to push things over the edge. Carl helped us again by finding evidence of Richard's past lawsuits, embezzlement, and fraud charges that had been quietly settled out of court. It was no longer just about custody. It was about exposing the truth. When we presented this new information to the judge, his face darkened. He turned to Mary and Richard, demanding an explanation. The courtroom was tense, and every second seemed to drag on like an eternity. Then, for the first time, Mary hesitated, and I realized that we had her cornered. Maria's hesitation was brief, but it was enough. The judge leaned forward, waiting for her answer. Richard, however, was not so calm. He scoffed, shaking his head. "This is just ridiculous. Those accusations have never been proven." Daniel stood up. "Your Honor, we have the records of the settlement. If there was nothing to hide, why were these cases settled out of court?" The judge nodded slowly, looking at Mary. "Mrs. Carter, do you believe that your children are in the safest environment possible?" Mary's silence spoke louder than any answer she could have given. The courtroom held its breath as Mary finally looked up. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The judge sighed and leaned back. "Given the evidence before me, I have no choice but to take these concerns seriously. I am ordering an immediate home examination." The weight of these words hit Mary like a freight train. Richard sat uncomfortably in his seat, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time. I could see it in their faces. They knew they were going to lose. After the hearing, I met with Daniel, Mike, and Carl to discuss strategy. "We need to be prepared," Daniel said. "Mary will try to hide everything she can before the examination begins. We need witnesses, documentation, anything that will strengthen our case." Mike nodded. "I'll keep an eye on Richard. If he tries anything, we'll know." As the days went by, Mary tried to put on a show, cleaning the house and making sure the outside looked spotless. But some things could not be hidden so easily. Neighbors whispered about strange visitors coming and going, about arguments that could be heard from the street. Carl continued to collect evidence, and each new piece of information made my case stronger. The day of the house appraisal came. My stomach was churning waiting for the news. When the appraiser finally entered Mary's house, it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. There were financial documents confirming unpaid debts, eviction notices, and even police reports of a disturbance at the home. My children's discomfort spoke louder than any documents. George hesitated, giving short answers, and Laura's little hands trembled whenever she was asked. The evaluator left without saying a word, their expressions neutral. I didn't know the results right away, but deep down I already knew I was winning. Mary knew it too. That evening I received a call from Daniel. The judge has scheduled an emergency hearing. Get ready. I took a deep breath. This was the moment I had been fighting for. The last battle before justice was mine. Richard did not show up. It was clear that he had no interest in fighting for a sinking ship. Mary, on the other hand, was desperate. She tried to argue, but her voice cracked under the pressure. The judge allowed her to speak and then calmly delivered his sentence. I was granted primary custody of my children. Tears came to my eyes as I looked at George and Laura. They were coming home with me. I fought through pain, betrayal, and humiliation, but in the end I won. I couldn't read anything on Mary's face, but I didn't care anymore. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. As I left the courtroom with my children, I realized that revenge was never my real goal. It was justice, and finally, after years of suffering, I found it.